The Nintendo Entertainment System, a cornerstone of gaming history. For many, it brings back memories of simpler times, of endless hours spent trying to beat that one impossible level. But not every game was just innocent fun. Some NES titles stirred up more than just childhood nostalgia. They ignited controversy. Today we're going to take a deep dive into the most controversial NES games ever released. Starting off our list is Taboo: The Sixth Sense, a game that promised to tell your fortune. Developed by Rare and released in 1989, Taboo was less of a traditional game and more of a virtual tarot card reading. The game's mystical theme and predictions, which sometimes included unsettling messages, led to it being viewed with suspicion by parents and conservative groups. Many feared it was introducing children to occult practices. Despite its controversial nature, Taboo: The Sixth Sense captivated a niche audience intrigued by its unique premise. The game utilized a virtual tarot deck and offered cryptic fortunes, which often spurred curiosity and superstition among its players. Rare's dedication to depart from conventional gameplay was both bold and innovative, as it pushed the boundaries of what video games could represent. However, this audacity also placed Taboo at the center of debates about media influence and the appropriateness of certain themes for younger audiences. The game's eerie atmosphere, coupled with the novelty of an interactive fortune-telling experience, ensured that it remained a memorable, albeit divisive, title in the late 1980s gaming landscape. Chiller is another game that stirred up quite a bit of controversy. Originally an arcade shooter, it was ported to the NES in 1990, but what set Chiller apart was its graphic and gory content. Players were tasked with shooting at various scenes of torture and dismemberment, something that was unheard of for the NES's typical family-friendly lineup. The game was heavily criticized for its violent imagery and was banned in several countries. Despite its notorious reputation, Chiller garnered a cult following due to its shocking and boundary-pushing content. The game's stark departure from the NES's generally wholesome image was both a point of fascination and contention. It features macabre environments where players could shoot at helpless victims and scenes of torture chambers and haunted houses. A stark contrast to the lighthearted fare typically seen on the platform. The game's existence sparked heated discussions about censorship, the impact of violent media on youth, and the responsibilities of game developers. Its infamy was further amplified by its ban in several countries, cementing Chiller as a provocative piece of gaming history that challenged societal norms and the limits of acceptability in video games. Before we move on, I want to know your thoughts. Do you have any of these games? Have you heard of these games? I'm sure you've heard of a few of them. Did you know they were controversial? Sound off in the comments below. Let me know what you think. Now back to our list. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was controversial primarily due to its bewildering gameplay mechanics and perceived lack of quality. Released in 1989, it promised an engaging experience based on the classic novel, but delivered something far less coherent. The game's primary controversy stemmed from its confusing design. Players were expected to alternate between the personas of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but the transition between these characters was erratic and poorly explained. This led to a disjointed gameplay experience that left many players frustrated and perplexed. The unclear objectives and random enemy behavior only added to the confusion, making it difficult for players to progress or understand the game's narrative. As a result, many felt that the game was misleading in its promises and ultimately unplayable. Further fueling the controversy was the widespread belief that the game was a blatant cash grab. Critics argued that it was rushed to market without sufficient testing or quality control, leading to numerous technical issues such as glitches, unfair difficulty spikes, and poor audio-visual quality. The game's graphics and sound were subpar even by the standards of the late 1980s, and the lack of polish was evident throughout the entire experience. Many parents, feeling deceived by what they perceived as a scam, demanded refunds. The negative reception was not just limited to consumers, it also drew the ire of gaming critics who lambasted it for its lack of creativity, coherence, and playability. The combination of technical failures and deceptive marketings made Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde a symbol of what was wrong in the gaming industry at the time, sparking debates about consumer rights and the responsibility of game developers and publishers. Action 52 is a compilation of 52 games released in 1991. Marketed with the slogan, 52 games in one cartridge. It sounded like a great deal. However, the reality was far from it. The games were buggy, unfinished, and often unplayable. The controversy stemmed from what many saw as false advertising and exploitation of consumers. Action 52 became a symbol of greed and lack of quality control in the gaming industry. The compilation's development was rushed with a mere 3 months dedicated to creating all 52 games, resulting in numerous glitches and crashes. Among these games, titles like Cheetah Men stood out not for their quality, but for their laughable attempts at creating a new franchise, which failed spectacularly. The high price tag of $199 exacerbated consumer dissatisfaction, as buyers felt they had been grossly overcharged for what was essentially a collection of broken, substandard games. This infamous release is often cited in discussions about the worst video games in history, serving as a cautionary tale of overpromising and under-delivering in the gaming market. The legacy of Action 52 extends beyond its immediate failure, as it has since become a cult classic and the subject of interest among retro gaming enthusiasts. Last but not least, we have Bionic Commando, and I know you're probably thinking, Bionic Commando, what are you talking about? Well, Bionic Commando was controversial primarily due to its original Japanese version titled Top Secret: Hitler's Resurrection, which featured explicit Nazi imagery and references to Adolf Hitler. The game included swastikas and other Nazi symbols, and the final boss was a resurrected Hitler, which sparked significant backlash given the sensitivity surrounding World War II and the Holocaust. To avoid offending international audiences, Capcom made extensive changes for the Western release, removing swastikas and renaming Hitler to Master Z, and altering the enemy faction's identity from neo-Nazis to a fictional group called the Bads. These alterations underscored the delicate balance between creative content and cultural sensitivity, illustrating the challenges of localizing games with controversial historical themes. Despite the extensive changes made for the Western release, Bionic Commando still faced scrutiny for its connections to its original content. However, these modifications allowed the game to reach a broader audience and avoid potential bans in sensitive markets. The Western version, released in 1988, was well received for its innovative gameplay mechanics, particularly the protagonist's use of a bionic arm for swinging across gaps, which added a unique twist to the platforming genre. This feature, combined with its challenging levels and engaging storyline, helped Bionic Commando gain a dedicated fanbase. The controversy surrounding its original content, coupled with the successful adaptation for international markets, highlights the complexities developers face when dealing with sensitive historical material. It also emphasizes the impact of cultural considerations on the localization process, which can significantly alter a game's narrative and reception across different regions. The NES era was a formative time for the gaming industry, full of innovation and creativity. The introduction of iconic franchises like Super Mario Bros., The Legend of Zelda, and Metroid set new standards for gameplay, narrative, and design. However, this period also had its fair share of controversies, which continued into the Super Nintendo era. Issues such as censorship, violent content, and the representation of gender and race in games spark heated debates. For instance, the American version of many games underwent significant alterations to meet Nintendo of America's strict content guidelines, which sometimes led to the removal or modification of religious symbols, graphic violence, and sexual content. As gaming continues to evolve, the lessons learned from these controversial titles remain relevant. Reflecting on the NES era, it becomes clear that the dialogue between developers, players, and regulators is crucial in shaping a responsible and innovative future for gaming. What are your thoughts on these games? Were they a product of their time, or did they push the boundaries too far? Let me know in the comments below. If you liked this video, please leave a like, and if you didn't, that other button seems to work pretty well too. And if you're new here, please consider subscribing for a plethora of gaming related content. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Golgo 13 Top Secret Episode, released for the NES in 1988, and stands as one of the most controversial games of its era, pushing the boundaries of what was deemed acceptable in video games at the time. Based on the popular Japanese manga series about a professional assassin, Duke Togo, the game brought mature themes that were rarely seen in the relatively family-friendly NES library. Players navigated through a complex plot involving espionage, assassination, and conspiracy, with gameplay elements including first-person shooting, side-scrolling action, and even sniping missions. The graphic content, including the depiction of blood and violence, was particularly bold for a console primarily marketed to children. Additionally, scenes suggesting sexual content, although not explicit, were enough to raise eyebrows and generate controversy among parents and media watchdogs, questioning the appropriateness of material for younger audiences. The controversy surrounding Golgo 13 wasn't limited to its mature themes. The game's narrative delved into politically sensitive topics, such as the Cold War, bioweapons, and international terrorism. These subjects were not only ambitious but also provocative, leading to debates about the role of video games in addressing real-world issues. The intricate storyline, combined with its adult-oriented content, challenged the norms of video game storytelling at the time, paving the way for more mature narratives in the industry. Despite the backlash, or perhaps because of it, Golgo 13 garnered a cult following and is remembered today as a pioneering title that dared to tackle sophisticated and controversial themes, influencing the evolution of video game content and censorship discussion in the years to come. Maniac Mansion, released for the NES in 1990, quickly became the subject of controversy due to its unconventional and mature content. Developed by Lucasfilm Games, the game introduced players to the bizarre and creepy world of the Edison family and their sinister mansion. Unlike most NES games, Maniac Mansion featured a point-and-click adventure format, which allowed players to interact with various objects and characters, leading to multiple story paths and endings. The game's dark humor, combined with themes of kidnapping, mad science, and even implied adult content, sparked concerns among parents and media critics. Notably, certain lines of dialogue and scenes, such as the ability to microwave a hamster, seen as inappropriate for young audiences the NES typically catered to, leading Nintendo to demand significant edits before allowing the game's release on their platform. The censorship imposed on Maniac Mansion added another layer to its controversial status. Nintendo's strict content policies led to the removal of various suggestive and politically offensive elements, including language and visual gags. This censorship was a point of contention as many fans and critics argued that it compromised the game's original artistic vision and humor. Despite these changes, or perhaps because of the curiosity they generated, Maniac Mansion gained a dedicated fan base and is now regarded as a cult classic. The controversy surrounding the game highlighted the ongoing debate about video game content and the balance between creative freedom and content regulation, setting a precedent for future discussions on censorship in the gaming industry. Mike Tyson's Punch-Out! Punch-Out? Hold on. Yep, that's what it says. Okay. Mike Tyson's Punch-Out! Released for the NES in 1987 and became a cultural phenomenon, but it also stirred controversy due to its portrayal of ethnic stereotypes and its association with the controversial figure Mike Tyson. The game featured a lineup of opponents from various countries, each depicted with exaggerated traits that bordered on caricature. Characters like Frenchman Glass Joe, the Japanese Piston Honda, and the Indian Great Tiger played into broad stereotypes that were criticized for being insensitive and reinforcing negative perceptions. While these portrayals were intended to be humorous and exaggerated, they nonetheless sparked discussions about representation and the potential impact of such stereotypes on young audiences. Additionally, the game's association with Mike Tyson added to its controversial reputation. At the time of the game's release, Tyson was the undisputed heavyweight champion and a global superstar. However, his personal life was marred by legal issues and allegations of violence, which cast a shadow over the game's image. The controversy peaked when Tyson was convicted of rape in 1992, leading Nintendo to sever ties with him and re-release the game as Punch-Out! Featuring Mr. Dream, replacing Tyson with a fictional character. This decision underscored the challenges companies face when associating their products with real-life personalities, especially those with tumultuous personal lives. Despite these controversies, Mike Tyson's Punch-Out! Remains a beloved classic, remembered for its challenging gameplay and iconic status in the NES library.
To raise the incredibly accurate Zapper and play games like Duck Hunt or action-packed Hogan's Alley and high-flying Kung Fu, each sold separately.
Before we get to the last two games on this list, let me know your thoughts so far in the comments below. I'll be honest, I wasn't expecting Punch-Out! To be on this list, but when I found it during my research, I definitely wanted to add it. And along with that, I really want to know what you think, so let me know in the comments below. Friday the 13th released for the NES in 1989 and garnered significant controversy due to its attempt to translate the slasher film genre into video game format. Based on the popular horror movie franchise, the game placed players in the role of camp counselors tasked with protecting children from the infamous killer Jason Voorhees. The game's dark premise, involving the gruesome murder of characters, was a stark departure from the family-friendly image Nintendo often promoted. Critics and parents were particularly concerned about the game's violent content. While not graphically explicit due to the NES's limitations, still conveyed a sense of horror and dread that was unusual for the time. The atmosphere, combined with the eerie soundtrack and sudden appearances of Jason, contributed to a gaming experience that many deemed too intense for younger players. The gameplay mechanics and difficulty level also fueled controversy. Friday the 13th was notorious for its challenging and often frustrating gameplay, with critics citing unclear objectives and repetitive tasks. Players had to navigate the camp, search cabins, and engage in combat with Jason, who could appear unpredictably, leading to sudden and often unavoidable encounters. This high difficulty, combined with the dark theme, led some to question whether the game was appropriate for the NES's broad audience. Despite its controversial nature, Friday the 13th has maintained a cult following among gamers. It stands as a unique example of early attempts to bring horror into video games, reflecting the challenges and debates around content appropriateness and the portrayal of violence in gaming. Monster Party, released for the NES in 1989, stirred controversy due to its bizarre and often grotesque imagery, which stood out even among the quirky titles of the era. The game follows a young boy named Mark, who teams up with a gargoyle named Bert to battle an array of strange and monstrous enemies. What set Monster Party apart was its dark and surreal atmosphere, featuring a mix of horror and absurdity. The game included graphic depictions of blood and unsettling enemy designs, such as a giant disembodied head and melting faces. This macabre content was considered too intense for younger audiences, clashing with the generally lighthearted tone of most NES games. Parents and critics alike were taken aback by the stark and sometimes disturbing visual elements, leading to debates about the appropriateness of such imagery in children's entertainment. Adding to the controversy was the game's strange blend of humor and horror, which left many unsure of its intended audience. Monster Party incorporated a variety of pop culture references and parodies, some of which were more mature in nature. The game's tone fluctuated between goofy and genuinely creepy, creating a dissonant experience that confused and sometimes unsettled players. The initial Japanese version of the game was even more graphic and significantly altered for its North American release, but traces of its original content remain. Despite its controversial elements, Monster Party has developed a cult following with fans appreciating its unique approach and surreal charm. The game remains a notable example of how blending genres and pushing the boundaries of content can lead to both backlash and enduring fascination. As we've explored, the NES era was not just a time of pixelated graphics and chiptune music, but also a period of significant experimentation and boundary pushing in video game content. These games each brought their own flavor of controversy, challenging the norms of what video games could address and how they presented their narratives, sparking important conversations about censorship, representation, and the impact of mature content on younger players, discussions that are still relevant in today's gaming industry. Despite the controversies, or perhaps because of them, these games have left an indelible mark on the history of gaming, remembered for their bold choices and unique contributions. It's clear that the gaming landscape has always been a dynamic and evolving medium, capable of provoking thought and pushing cultural boundaries. The controversies surrounding these titles highlight the complexities and growing pains of an industry finding its voice. As gamers and creators continue to push the envelope, it's essential to remember the lessons from these early controversies. They remind us of the power of video games as a form of expression and the importance of balancing creative freedom with cultural sensitivity and responsibility. Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching. What are your thoughts on the games on this list? Have you played any of them? They're not as obscure as the games on the first list, but I'm sure some of you have played them. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you liked this video, please leave a like, and if you didn't, that other button seems to work pretty well too. And if you're new here, please consider subscribing for a plethora of gaming-related content. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Raid 2020, released for the NES in 1989, garnered significant controversy due to its depiction of drug use and dystopian themes. Set in a grim future where drug lords dominate society, the game cast players as a law enforcement officer tasked with eradicating the rampant drug problem. The dark and gritty storyline, which included elements such as drug raids and confrontations with addicts, was a stark contrast to the more lighthearted, family-friendly games typically found on the NES. Critics and parents were particularly concerned about the game's portrayal of drugs and the moral implications of its violent gameplay, raising questions about the appropriateness of such themes for young audiences. Moreover, the game's controversial nature was amplified by its execution and presentation. Raid 2020 was criticized for its graphic imagery and its unsettling atmosphere, which many felt were too intense for the console's primary demographic. The game's depiction of a bleak, crime-ridden future, combined with its focus on drug-related violence, made it a lightning rod for debates about video game content and its impact on children. These discussions were part of a larger conversation happening at the time about the role of video games in society and the responsibility of game developers and publishers. Despite the controversy, Raid 2020 has maintained a certain cult status among retro gaming enthusiasts, remembered for its bold attempt to tackle serious issues within the constraints of an 8-bit platform. Super Pitfall released for the NES in 1987 and became controversial not for its mature themes or graphic content, but for its notorious gameplay and design issues. As a reimagining of the classic Pitfall game, expectations were high, but players quickly found themselves frustrated by its poorly executed mechanics. The game featured a sprawling maze-like environment filled with hidden traps, invisible platforms, and cryptic puzzles that were nearly impossible to solve without a guide. Critics and players alike decried its lack of intuitive design, arguing that it relied too heavily on trial and error, leading to an experience that was more frustrating than fun. This poor reception highlighted the growing pains of translating successful arcade games to home consoles, where different design philosophies often clashed. Adding to the controversy was the game's numerous technical flaws, including frequent glitches and inconsistent collision detection, which made progress feel random and unfair. The graphics and sound were also considered subpar, even by the standards of the time, contributing to the sense that Super Pitfall was a rushed and poorly crafted product. These issues led to widespread disappointment and backlash from fans of the original Pitfall series, who felt that the NES version did not live up to its legacy. The negative reception of Super Pitfall sparked discussions about quality control and the importance of playtesting in game development, underlining the challenges faced by developers during the rapidly evolving video game market of the late 1980s. Despite its controversial reception, Super Pitfall remains a noteworthy example of how high expectations and poor executions can collide, leaving a lasting impact on a game's reputation. Bible Adventures, released for the NES in 1991 by Wisdom Tree, sparked controversy due to its religious content and the unconventional manner of its distribution. Unlike most NES games, which were officially licensed by Nintendo, Bible Adventures was an unlicensed title. This meant it bypassed Nintendo's rigorous quality control and approval process, leading to concerns about the game's standards and its potential impact on the broader gaming market. The game's religious themes, which included reenacting stories from the Bible, such as Noah's Ark and David and Goliath, also drew mixed reactions. Some parents and religious groups praised the game for providing a family-friendly alternative to more violent or secular games, while others criticized it for its simplistic and sometimes inaccurate portrayals of biblical events. Moreover, the gameplay and design of Bible Adventures received significant criticism. The game was often described as clunky and poorly made, with repetitive tasks and frustrating mechanics. Players had to collect animals and items while dealing with awkward controls and lackluster graphics. Despite these issues, the game's overt religious messaging was the primary point of contention. Critics argued that Bible Adventures was more of a didactic tool than an entertaining game, leading to debates about the role of religious content in video games and whether such titles should adhere to the same standards as other commercial games. The controversy surrounding Bible Adventures highlighted the challenges of integrating educational or religious themes into the gaming medium while maintaining the entertainment value and quality that players expect. Despite its polarizing reception, Bible Adventures remains a unique artifact in the history of NES games, reflecting the diverse and often contentious landscape of early video game development. Before we move on with the rest of this list, I want to know your thoughts in the comments below. Let me know about the games on this list or any of the games I've mentioned in previous lists. Let's get some conversations going in the comments below. And while you're down there, why don't you leave a like? Alright, back to the list. Nightshade, released for the NES in 1992, stands out as a controversial game due to its dark tone and mature themes, which were unusual for the platform. Set in a gritty, crime-ridden city, the game follows the protagonist Nightshade as he attempts to take down a criminal mastermind named Sutek. The game combined elements of action and adventure with unique point-and-click interface, offering a more complex and narrative-driven experience than typical NES titles. Its mature storyline involving crime, corruption, and vigilantism drew criticism from players and watchdog groups concerned about exposing young players to such heavy themes. This criticism was amplified by the game's darker visual style and atmosphere, which contrasted sharply with the more colorful and whimsical games commonly associated with the NES. Adding to the controversy was the game's difficulty and design choices. Nightshade was known for its challenging puzzles and non-linear progression, which some players found frustrating. The game featured a limited lives system, and upon losing all lives, players would see a game over screen where Nightshade is strapped to a table with a laser descending toward him, a scene reminiscent of classic spy thrillers, but deemed too intense for younger viewers. Furthermore, the game included references to adult concepts and sarcastic humor that were atypical for NES games, sparking debates about appropriate content in video games. Despite these controversies, Nightshade has been praised for its ambition and innovative blends of genres, earning a cult following among retro gaming enthusiasts who appreciate its unique approach and willingness to push the boundaries of what an NES game could be. Mighty Bomb Jack, released for the NES in 1986, and became a source of controversy, primarily due to its notorious difficulty and perceived unfair gameplay mechanics. As a sequel to the arcade hit Bomb Jack, expectations were high, but the NES version quickly garnered a reputation for being exceedingly hard and unforgiving. Players controlled Jack, navigating through a pyramid filled with dangerous enemies and traps while collecting bombs to progress through the levels. The game's difficulty spike with random enemy placements and the requirement to collect bombs in a specific sequence to avoid penalties left many players frustrated. Critics argued that the game's punishing design was not just challenging, but borderline unfair, detracting from the overall fun and playability. Adding to the controversy was the game's scoring and power-up system, which confused many players. Mighty Bomb Jack featured a unique but convoluted system where collecting a certain item could either help or hinder the player, depending on how they were used. This lack of clarity led to a steep learning curve and a sense of trial and error that many found off-putting. Furthermore, the game was criticized for its repetitive levels and lack of innovation compared to other NES titles of the time, leading some to view it as a step backward in game design. Despite these issues, Mighty Bomb Jack has since developed a cult following, with some players appreciating its challenging nature and nostalgic charm.
So the boy fell asleep.
As we've explored in this series, the NES era was not only a time for innovation and creativity, but also a period marked by significant controversies that helped shape the future of video gaming. From Golgo 13 and its mature themes to the punishing difficulty of Mighty Bomb Jack, these games pushed boundaries in ways that sparked debates among parents, critics, and players alike. Each title, with its unique approach and content, contributed to ongoing discussions about the role of video games in entertainment and society. They forced both developers and the broader community to confront challenging questions about representation, censorship, and the balance between artistic expression and audience expectations. Reflecting on these controversial NES games, it's clear that they played a crucial role in the evolution of the medium. They serve as reminders of a time when the gaming industry was still finding its footing and exploring the vast potential of what video games could be. The lessons learned from these controversies continue to influence game development today, reminding us of the importance of innovation, the impact of content on diverse audiences, and the need for thoughtful, inclusive design. Thank you so much for watching. What are your thoughts on the games on this list, or any of the other lists I've done? Let me know in the comments below. If you liked this video, leave a like, and if you didn't, that other button seems to work pretty well too. If you're new here, please consider subscribing for a plethora of gaming-related content. And, hint hint, you'll want to stay tuned because we're going to move from the NES to my favorite console, the Super Nintendo, next, and look at some controversial games for that system. So you'll want to stay tuned. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one. Abadox, released for the NES in 1990, was a shoot-'em-up game that quickly became controversial for its unsettling and gruesome imagery. Set inside a gigantic alien organism, Abadox features grotesque biological enemies, from floating eyeballs to tentacle monsters and decomposing flesh walls, creating a visceral horror experience rarely seen in games of its time. The game's graphics were notably graphic, with some enemies exploding into gory chunks upon defeat, pushing the boundaries of what was considered acceptable on a family-friendly console like the NES. This macabre art style was unlike the typical cartoonish or fantasy visuals that most NES players were accustomed to, sparking debates among parents and media critics about the game's suitability for younger audiences. Additionally, Abadox was controversial due to its eerie and disturbing atmosphere, which was amplified by its music and sound effects. The soundtrack featured unsettling, dissonant compositions that added a layer of tension and fear to the gameplay. The combination of dark, body horror-inspired visuals with a chilling soundtrack created an experience that some felt was too intense for the NES, a system often marketed toward children. The game's overall tone and aesthetic made it a divisive title among gamers, with some praising its unique style and ambitious design, while others criticized it for being overly grotesque and too disturbing for a mainstream audience. Deadly Towers, released for the NES in 1987, quickly became one of the most controversial games on the platform, but not for the reasons you might expect. Rather than dealing with mature themes or graphic content, Deadly Tower earned its notoriety through its challenging and often frustrating gameplay. The game was plagued by cryptic design choices, including maze-like dungeons, frequent enemy respawns, and punishing difficulty spikes. Players often found themselves lost in the game's vast and confusing labyrinths, with little to no guidance on how to progress. The controls were clunky, the hit detection was inconsistent, and the game's graphics were considered poor even by the standards of its time. Many critics felt that these issues made the game feel unfair and overly difficult, leading to its reputation as one of the worst NES games ever released. The controversy around Deadly Towers wasn't just about its gameplay flaws. It also sparked broader debates about quality control and consumer expectations in the gaming industry. Players who had purchased the game based on its promising fantasy adventure premise felt misled by the experience it delivered. The backlash was strong enough that Deadly Towers became a cautionary tale for game developers, demonstrating the importance of playtesting and thoughtful design. Its infamy persisted over the years, making it a prime example of how poor game design can turn a potentially great idea into a frustrating ordeal. The game's failure also fueled discussions on the need for more consistent quality standards for NES titles, as players and critics alike called for better experiences on the beloved console. River City Ransom, released for the NES in 1989, was an innovative beat-em-up game that stirred controversy for its unconventional mix of genres and atypical gameplay elements. Unlike many side-scrolling brawlers of the time, River City Ransom combined action RPG mechanics, allowing players to level up their characters by buying items, learning new moves, and exploring an open world. While this blend of gameplay styles has been praised in retrospect, at the time it confused and frustrated some players who expected a straightforward fighting game experience. The game's open-ended design and non-linear progression were ahead of their time, but these same features led to criticism from those who found the lack of guidance and structure disorienting and overly complex for the NES's target audience. Moreover, River City Ransom became a subject of controversy due to its portrayal of street violence and gang culture. The game featured high school students engaging in hand-to-hand combat across city streets, which raised concern among some parents and media outlets about its potential influence on young players. The comic-style violence, while not graphically intense, was persuasive throughout the game, with players using various weapons from chains to trash cans to defeat their enemies. Despite its cartoonish aesthetic, the setting and content of River City Ransom led to debates over whether such themes were appropriate for a family-oriented console like the NES. However, this controversy also helped to cement its reputation as a cult classic, attracting players who appreciated its bold approach to storytelling and gameplay, challenging the status quo of the video game landscape at the time. Castlevania II: Simon's Quest, released for the NES in 1988, and quickly became a controversial title among fans of the original Castlevania game due to its dramatic shifting gameplay style and design philosophy. Unlike the straightforward, linear action of its predecessor, Simon's Quest introduced RPG elements like exploration, leveling up, and an open-world map filled with cryptic puzzles and hidden paths. Many players were frustrated by the game's lack of direction and vague hints, which often required trial and error or consulting outside sources to make any real progress. The infamous day-night cycle, which abruptly halted the action and increased the difficulty of enemies after dark, also drew criticism for interrupting the gameplay flow and making an already challenging game feel more unforgiving.
Why does this need to happen so often? Like every 5 minutes? Why does it take so long? Nobody feels like sitting through this every time. How would you like it if you were playing a game and then every 5 minutes I came over and paused it, then counted 10 tedious seconds and then let you continue to play the game? Now, I mean, why did they think that that would be a good idea and interrupt the gameplay? Did they think it would be more realistic?
The controversy surrounding Castlevania II wasn't just about its complex mechanics. It was also fueled by issues with its English localization. Poorly translated dialogue led to confusion, with in-game clues often being misleading or nonsensical, causing players to struggle through the game without understanding what to do next. These flaws were so significant they became a key talking point in the gaming community, leading to debates about the importance of a clear communication in game design. Despite these issues, Simon's Quest has developed a cult following over the years, with some players appreciating its ambitious attempt to blend action with RPG elements. Yet for many, the game's unorthodox approach and frustrating design choices have cemented it as one of the most polarizing entries in the Castlevania series. Rolling Thunder, released for the NES in 1989, stirred controversy for multiple reasons, including its depiction of violence and the portrayal of villains that bore a striking resemblance to real-world extremist groups. As a side-scrolling shooter, Rolling Thunder cast players as a secret agent infiltrating enemy bases to rescue a captive ally. The game's enemy, known as the Geldra, wore hooded robes and face masks, drawing criticism for the visual similarities to the Ku Klux Klan and other terrorist organizations. These resemblances sparked debates over whether the game's content was appropriate for a younger audience and whether it unintentionally perpetuated harmful stereotypes or invoked real-world political imagery. Additionally, there were unsettling undertones in the storyline, with references that implied to the female captive Leela had been tortured or assaulted, including suggestions of rape, which many found highly inappropriate for a game on a family-oriented console like the NES. Beyond its contentious themes, Rolling Thunder was also criticized for its high difficulty level and unforgiving gameplay mechanics. With limited lives, a strict time limit, and enemies that dealt significant damage, many players found the game to be overly punishing. These elements, combined with the darker narrative implications, led to frustration and backlash from both casual gamers and critics who felt that its design and themes were too extreme for the broader NES audience. While some appreciated the challenge and arcade-style action, others argued that the game's design choices and mature, controversial elements made it a polarizing title. Despite these issues, Rolling Thunder retained a cult following among fans who admired its distinctive style and intense, albeit controversial, gameplay. Wait, are we already halfway done? Man, time flies when you're having fun, doesn't it? What are your thoughts so far? Let me know in the comments below. A lot of these games were suggestions from you all, so I want to thank you for your suggestions. And before we continue, if you're liking the video, please leave a like. It helps out more than you know. Alright, enough stalling. Let's get back to the list. Smash TV, released for the NES in 1991, quickly became one of the most controversial games of its time due to its hyper-violent gameplay and provocative social commentary. The game, set in a dystopian future where contestants fight to the death on a televised game show, features relentless action with waves of enemies, exploding bodies, and a shower of pixelated blood and gore. For a console known for its family-friendly image, Smash TV pushed boundaries with its intense and graphic content, sparking concern among parents and critics who felt the game's depiction of violence was excessive. The premise of turning mass slaughter into entertainment was seen by some as a commentary on society's growing decentralization to violence, but it also drew criticism for glamorizing brutality and raising questions about the appropriateness of such themes for younger audiences. Additionally, Smash TV was controversial for its satirical take on consumer culture and media sensationalism. The game's setting, a deadly game show where contestants kill for cash and prizes, was seen as a biting critique of society's obsession with materialism and the lengths to which people would go for fame and fortune. The in-game prizes, like VCRs, toasters, and vacations, were exaggerated symbols of consumer greed, adding a layer of dark humor to the carnage. While some players appreciated the satirical edge and saw it as a clever commentary on the excess of the late 1980s and early 1990s, others were uncomfortable with the game's blending of humor and extreme violence. This mix of shocking content and social critique made Smash TV one of the most talked about and debated titles on the NES, solidifying its place in gaming history as a provocatively controversial experience. Death Race, an NES adaptation of the infamous 1976 arcade game, was shrouded in controversy from the start due to its violent premise and dark themes. The game tasked players with driving a car to run over humanoid figures that were described as gremlins or monsters, but their humanoid appearance led many to believe that players were actually running over people. The simplistic graphics of the NES version did little to dispel this notion, sparking outrage among parents and critics who felt that it promoted wanton violence. The outcry was further fueled by the game's celebratory tone, where running over these figures rewarded players with points, reinforcing the idea that it was trivializing violence and even encouraging reckless behavior. Adding to the controversy, Death Race also faced criticism for its lack of clear context or narrative to justify its violent gameplay, making it seem senseless and gratuitous to many. Unlike other games that had some sort of storyline or hero's journey, Death Race provided little explanation for why the player was committing these acts, which led to further backlash. The lack of moral framework or any redeeming qualities led to accusations that it glorified violence and desensitized players to its consequences. Despite, or perhaps because of its notoriety, Death Race became a cult hit among some gamers who were drawn to its rebellious reputation, but also it sparked a debate over the role of violence in video games, making it one of the earliest examples of a game that stirred significant public controversy. NARC, released for the NES in 1990, became a lightning rod for controversy due to its unapologetic portrayal of the war on drugs and its extreme level of violence. The game put players in the role of two narcotics officers tasked with taking down a drug syndicate, but it wasn't your typical crime-fighting game. Players were encouraged to use excessive force, wielding guns, rocket launchers, and grenades to blow up enemies who were often depicted as junkies, drug dealers, and thugs. The graphic nature of the violence, especially for an NES game, shocked many. Exploding bodies, dismemberment, and bloodshed were common sights, which led to concern among parents and advocacy groups about the game's impact on young players and its appropriateness for the platform's predominantly youthful audience. Beyond its violent content, NARC also sparked debate over its depiction of drug addiction and crime. Critics argued that the game's simplistic black and white portrayal of the drug epidemic failed to capture the complexity of the issue. instead opting for a heavy-handed, shoot-first approach that seemed to glorify police brutality. The game's "Just Say No" message was undermined by its focus on violent vigilante justice, making it appear contradictory and morally ambiguous. While some players praised NARC for its boldness and unique take on the action genre, others saw it as a troubling example of how games could trivialize real-world issues. This mix of intense violence and controversial themes ensured that NARC left a lasting impression, sparking debates that continue to this day about the role of socially conscious themes in video games. Uninvited, released for the NES in 1991, stirred controversy with its unsettling horror themes and eerie atmosphere, making it a standout among the otherwise family-friendly NES library. As a point-and-click adventure game, Uninvited placed players in a haunted mansion filled with supernatural phenomena and grisly encounters. The game's content, including ghostly apparitions, dark magic, and disturbing imagery, was a stark contrast to the more whimsical or action-oriented games of the time. The sense of dread and horror, amplified by chilling sound effects and a macabre storyline, drew criticism from some media outlets for being too intense and frightening for a younger audience. This blend of horror and gameplay mechanics was seen as pushing the boundaries of what was deemed appropriate for a console typically marketed toward children. Furthermore, Uninvited faced backlash for its depiction of occult and supernatural elements. The game delved into themes of dark magic and the occult, featuring scenes and puzzles involving mystical symbols and ghostly entities. These elements were controversial among parents and media critics who were concerned about the potential influence of such content on young gamers. The game's unsettling atmosphere and mature themes, combined with its relatively obscure gameplay mechanics, made it a polarizing title. While some players appreciated its unique approach to the adventure genre and its ability to deliver genuine scares, others felt it was out of place on the NES, contributing to debates about the suitability of horror-themed games for younger audiences.
And then it was time for Toronto to drown in the sweet sorrow of the crash at Demonhead!
Released for the NES in 1989, raised eyebrows and sparked controversy due to its unconventional narrative and strange blends of gameplay elements. The game combined platforming, shooting, and RPG mechanics in a way that was unique for its time but also bewildering to some players. It featured a non-linear story filled with bizarre characters and cryptic dialogue, an unpredictable plot twist that left many players confused. The narrative's absurdist style, ranging from encounters with talking animals to a storyline involving a doomsday device, challenged the norms of game storytelling on the NES, and some felt it was too strange or disjointed to be enjoyable. This led to a divide among players. While some appreciated the game's ambition and originality, others criticized it for being overly complex and lacking clear direction. Beyond its odd narrative, Clash at Demonhead also drew controversy for its slightly risque content, which included characters in skimpy outfits and suggested dialogue not typically found in NES titles. While relatively tame by today's standards, these elements were seen as pushing the envelope for a console aimed at a younger audience. The game's surreal tone and unconventional themes, coupled with its occasional forays into adult humor, left many parents concerned and led to some media backlash. Despite or maybe because of these controversies, Clash at Demonhead developed a cult following among players who embraced its quirky style and unconventional approach, turning it into a hidden gem that remains a topic of discussion among retro gaming enthusiasts today. The NES era was marked by an incredible diversity of games, many of which pushed boundaries and sparked debate. From graphic violence and mature themes to controversial depictions of real-world issues, these titles often challenged the norms of what was expected from a family-friendly console. While some games became lightning rods for public outcry, others simply introduced innovative mechanics that frustrated or confused players at the time. Regardless, The controversies surrounding these games are part of what made the NES such a significant platform in the history of gaming. These bold choices, whether intentional or not, contributed to the evolution of the medium, showing that video games could tackle complex subjects, push technical limits, and evoke strong reactions. As we end Season 1 of this series, it's clear that many of these games have found a second life as cult classics, appreciated for their willingness to take risks. Their controversies, once seen as flawed, are now viewed as some sign of ambition and creativity. Whether remembered for their gameplay innovations or the debates they sparked, these games have left a lasting legacy on the industry. They serve as a reminder that video games, even in their earliest forms, have always had the power to challenge, provoke, and entertain in ways that other media often cannot. Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching. I'm really glad you enjoyed this series. I'm having a lot of fun making it. As I mentioned before, this is just Season 1. There are tons of other games for different consoles to look at, so be sure to stay tuned for that. If you liked this video, please leave a like. It helps out more than you know. If you didn't, that other button seems to work pretty well too. And if you're new here, please consider subscribing for a plethora of gaming related content. Thank you so much for watching and your support. Join me next time when we dive into controversial games for the Super Nintendo. I'll see you then.